Hello, and welcome to today's webcast, brought to you by Compliance Week and Onspring. I'm Barbara Beeler with Compliance Week, and I'll be your host. Today's webcast is the simple secret that keeps compliance leaders ahead of change. I'd like to welcome today's speakers. It's my pleasure to introduce Andrea Karner, Vice President, Internal Audit at Schneider National. Prior to joining Schneider, she was Director of Internal Control and Audit Services at TDS. Andrea was responsible for leading all aspects of the internal audit function, the SOX 404 compliance program, and the anti-fraud program. We also have Jason Rohlf, Vice President of Solutions at Onspring. Jason is responsible for designing and developing their solution suite, providing sales support and domain expertise, and driving their go-to-market strategy with 20 plus years of internal audit, compliance, GRC, software, and consulting experience. I'd also like to welcome Kailyn Schutte, Senior Consultant on the Professional Services team at Onspring. She is responsible for implementing Onspring software for clients. The processes they implement on the Professional Services team involve internal audit, risk management, compliance, vendor management, policy management, and various other business functions. It's great to have all of you with us, and with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jason, Andrea, and Kailyn to get us started.
Great. Barbara, thank you so much, and thank you to everyone who made time to be with us today. Like Barbara said, my name is Jason Rohlf. I'll be your moderator for today's session. Certainly won't just have to hear from me. I'm excited to have Andrea and Kailyn here with me as well, as they're going to bring some really great real-world practical experience to our topic today. I'd also like to thank Compliance Week for the opportunity to deliver today's session. So we're looking forward to sharing our thoughts with you today. Okay, so let's just start with a cautionary tale. I was just kind of talking with the group here before we got on, and Andrea had actually suggested to me watching a great Netflix documentary called The Great Hack. So for those of you who haven't heard about Facebook and the Cambridge Analytica scandal in terms of how they were using their data, this was a good, if not somewhat unsettling documentary about this scandal, about some of the key players. And it really focused a lot on the Cambridge Analytica side of things. But for those of you who may not remember the details or understand exactly what happened, back in 2013, a gentleman by the name of Dr. Alexander Kogan developed an app for Facebook using their platform called This Is Your Digital Life. The intent was to gather information from people to help create psychological profiles of individuals in groups of different users for purely academic use. Well, as the law of unintended consequences states, there was a sort of a diversion in how that data was used. So despite the fact that Facebook had stipulations in their contract with this individual, with the developer of this app, with this individual who was gathering all of this user data, despite having these contractual requirements that this data was not to be sold or misused in any way, they went ahead and sold that information to Cambridge Analytica, who used it for a variety of unintended and one might argue nefarious purposes. The interesting thing about what happened at Facebook was that they did not specifically say that they could not get access to the data. In fact, it turns out that there was a loophole in their API that made it much easier for these app developers to not only get the content of the individuals who interacted with the apps, but also reach through their network of friends. So even though just maybe a couple 100,000 people actually took this exam on this app, they ended up securing data and information from approximately 80 million users. And again, that was used in a variety of ways that Facebook had never intended. In reading a little bit more about this, one of the things that caught my attention was when someone on the privacy team at Facebook was interviewed, and their comment was to the effect that, while their job and their primary purpose was to protect users and protect their data, they were often internally pitted against those who were actually responsible for driving revenue. So what happened was there was sort of an impasse between these two groups, and what ultimately happened was the need and the want and the desire to generate the revenue outweighed those privacy and security concerns. Well, this had a major impact on Facebook. This had a major impact on their market value. Once word came out about Cambridge Analytica misusing this data, and the fact that Facebook knew about it for some time before disclosing it, this caused an approximately $150 billion erosion in Facebook's market value within a matter of about 90 minutes. Not only that, this ultimately led to the complete downfall of Cambridge Analytica as an organization, but that's not exactly what we're here to talk about. We did a little research, and the International Association of Contract and Commercial Management noted that there's a 10% reduction in annual revenues due to poor contract management practices. So if an organization doesn't have good controls, good ways to manage and monitor the stipulations of their contracts, look at those as compliance requirements, certainly there's a large potential financial exposure there. Now, Facebook has gained some of that market share back, but certainly that reputational impact has really stayed with them. So, what do we learn from something like this, and how does this launch us into what we're about to talk about today? Well, I think lesson one is that mandating compliance is not enough. Facebook had stipulations that said this data was not to be used in this way and not to be sold. But there were still enough gaps and holes in their compliance structure where that data was ultimately exposed. So it's not enough to mandate compliance. It needs to be measured and monitored. There's also, as we can see, a significant opportunity cost, a significant reputational cost into not, to the extent possible, automating some of this reporting, leveraging data points that you're gathering just through the normal course of business and using them to come up with some level of insight about your organization. So the lesson, a fundamental lesson here, is data is going to be a key asset. Now, in the case of the folks who had their information stolen and misused, their data is sort of their private stamp, and I guess the expectation of privacy or rights to that data is a very cloudy issue. But when it comes to a compliance group and a compliance team, data is a key asset that can be used to, even if it in its simplest forms, can be used to drive very intuitive, actionable reporting and really drive your program forward. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and put up a survey question for you guys. I'd like to get your thoughts on this. So considering that data is kind of a key component here, we're just kind of interested to know what your biggest data challenge is. And so as you guys answer that, Andrea, I'm just kind of curious. You were the one who kind of turned me on to this Cambridge Analytica story, to the documentary. I'm just kind of curious if you had any additional thoughts to add in terms of those gaps and how proper management of data can help you address that.
Thanks, Jason. Well, I think at first blush that story is overwhelming, right? So being able to track and monitor what's going on with your data can just seem like an insurmountable task. There's so many things to keep your eyes on. But when you start peeling it back and thinking about, well, what can I do? What do I have at my fingertips that could help make things better? It's exactly what you said. It's that data is a key asset, and there are things that we have at our disposal that are very simple, that are created out of our normal course of business that we can use to flag us to leading indicators of stress or risk in our own processes. And those in turn can help us find where the fire is located.
Yeah, that's a great point. And, a lot of this, and this is something we'll explore, Kailyn's going to help walk us through kind of the thought process as well, but even exploring, what does it mean to, I have all this data, what does it mean to even, model it the right way? What are some steps we can take? We'll definitely chat about that. I've shared some of the poll results here, and it looks like, there are some common struggles across the board in terms of the biggest challenge associated with data. In fact, the plurality of everybody responding said that all of these particular areas, whether it's the actual recording and collecting of data, aggregating data from multiple sources, making sense out of the data, making it consumable and usable, and then finding the right insights. There's a lot of folks that struggle with all of that, and that does not surprise us. This is no small task, and there is no silver bullet answer. But what we're going to hope to share with you today are just some tips and tricks, and things that can be help you keep this in a very simple but meaningful light. So with that, Andrea did a great job of kind of setting this up for me, right? What are we going to explore today? Well, number one, we want to show you and talk about how you can leverage data in analytics to help drive improvements into the overall performance of your process, whatever that is. But we'll certainly talk about it in light of your struggles as someone in a compliance program. Andrea brought this point up, which I thought was great, which is once you have kind of that data leverage and you understand how you want to utilize it, it's thinking about how to proactively use that information to identify those stressors in the process, to identify those impacts within perhaps your risk environment. What are the things that are telling us where we might have exposures or other areas that might require a little bit more focus. And then certainly we want to talk about how this information can be used to operate more effectively in an uncertain environment. So, letting the data sort of be your guide, because there is value in that information. Okay, but before we do that, I'm just curious, we're gonna jump into another quick poll. So now I'm gonna kind of get a sense of how mature your processes are in terms of your ability to capture data, analyze it, and as we kind of get into that, as you guys answer these questions, let's see. Oh, the survey's out there, so go ahead and respond to that. But we really want to focus on some of the tactical tools and techniques that you can use. Let's see here. Oh, people are certainly responding here. And I think just to give you guys a little sneak peek at what I'm seeing here. Again, I think there's a small group of folks who are pretty confident that they have a very well-defined data management program, and that's fantastic. I really, I think everybody strives to be there. And let's go ahead and send those results to you guys so you can see what we're seeing. But basically, if you see that we have, about 45% of folks think that they're pretty well established, but they could certainly use a few tweaks here and there. It's kind of what we expected, almost like a bell curve of how the results are distributed. So there's a small percent that think they're not, really ready to get going or not ready to get some inspiration, I should say. And then there's others who feel like they're on the very mature end of that spectrum. Okay. So with that, we've talked a little bit about some kind of key exposures or, that cautionary tale, talked a little bit about kind of what we want to accomplish. So now let's get into some of this. And let's get into it with Andrea and Kailyn, because they're the ones who are very tactically involved in these activities on a day-to-day basis. I'm really excited to hear their perspective. So now we're going to just explore some simple steps and some, again, very practical, tactical ways that you can start thinking about your data and putting it to use for you. So we'll talk about how you brainstorm that data, right? What's going to lead you through that brainstorming process, some of the considerations to make when you're thinking about building and constructing those reports and to get those insights. And then certainly, as we move along that maturity cycle or that maturity timeline, if you will, we're going to look at some ways and some benefits of automating that data. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to bring Kailyn in. And Kailyn, I know you have lots of experience with this. You've worked on a number of these implementations. You've seen probably folks using a lot of the same reports, a lot of folks, coming up with their own ideas on how to manage data. So I'm really interested to get your perspective on the thought process that goes into this. And Andrea, obviously knowing your experience and exposure, that's going to be quite valuable to hear what you have to say here. But I'm going to go ahead and ask Kailyn to kind of step us through some of the concepts of building those insights. And we're going to start with how we brainstorm. So Kailyn, give us your thoughts here.
Thanks, Jason. So just like Jason described, what we're going to walk through here are some of those key steps that you can replicate to really make sure you're looking at your data and you're using that actionable insights from your data to leverage it to your advantage. So just as Jason explained, we're going to start with this brainstorming phase. So from the get-go, brainstorming how you can set up your data, your documentation, and how you can kind of get everything where it needs to be to utilize it to your full advantage. So the very first tip that we like to go through, and anytime I'm working with a client, is just right there on the screen. Start with the end in mind. So it sounds like a little bit in the weeds, but that's kind of on purpose. We want to make sure that as we're thinking about your data and as we're brainstorming how to structure everything, we want to know the simple question of what are we trying to accomplish using this data? What problems are we trying to solve? So through that conversation, that's where you're going to really start getting into the weeds and the details of how you need to start setting everything up throughout your data. So a story or just a little example here is walking through clients in the past and specifically talking about compliance or controls. And clients are going to tell me, they need these specific data points of maybe when a control is ready to test, or I need to know when a control is due for validation. So those are going to be kind of the specifics that we're talking about here. Is I need to know that end goal that we need to strive for and those most critical reporting elements that's going to really help me kind of build up and brainstorm how to move forward. So really quick, just still on this point of this entire concept of starting with the end in mind. Andrea, I thought I would kind of ask you, what does that necessarily mean to you as far as starting with the end in mind and kind of keeping that goal right up front from the get-go?
Sure. It means a couple of things. First, it's, what do I need to know in order to be able to effectively run my function? And that involves some of the things that you were talking about, like, okay, well, what controls do I need to test and when, et cetera. But also, I need to understand what my stakeholder needs are. What are the most common questions that are being asked of me and of my team? What needs for information do they have, and how quickly do they need it? And what are some of their pain points, not just with the information they have or maybe don't have, but with the consistency of the information they're receiving. So I think Jason mentioned, I've run some compliance functions in my past, and I've done it effectively with Excel, and I've done it effectively with a tool. And both can have challenges with respect to the integrity of the information that's being provided, whether it's working through challenges with how many items does Bob own versus maybe his name is recorded as Robert elsewhere, and then you're not getting a correct total, to current and up-to-date status on an item. So those are the things that I start with respect to the end in mind. But then I also think one step further, and that's, well, gosh, what would some of this information be able to do for me? How might I be able to leverage it to create some additional actionable insights for people, myself and my stakeholders? So for example, if I'm able to see that, wow, I've had a whole bunch of controls in a particular process area or function where stakeholder names, the control owner names have changed, or the process owner names have changed. Maybe I should check in with the leaders of those functions to understand what's happening in their organization. What's changing? Do we have increased risk because of changes in people or process? Or, for example, as I'm testing controls, am I able to look at a particular process and quickly identify, ooh, we have an increasing preponderance of control failures in this particular area. Let's dig into that and see what's going on here. What might I not know? Again, these are leading indicators of risk that can help you be more effective.
Yeah, and Andrea, it sounds like too the in your role when you're leading an audit function or a compliance function, it sounds like a lot of this might also be, hey, I have to anticipate or be able to clearly articulate with the board of directors, the audit committee, with senior management, what are they expecting us to be able to report on and even just use that as a starting point to work backwards from.
Correct.
Yep. Okay.
Yeah, that's perfect examples and kind of exactly what kind of that starting with the end in mind is meant for, making sure you understand what those critical reporting elements are and what those specifics are, which is a great segue into this second item here. And again, just another kind of tip and trick while you're brainstorming is now that you know or you've thought through or considered those exact data points that you need to start collecting or you need to start reporting on or you need to enhance on, well, let's go a step further and kind of as Andrea was explaining, let's plan out the workflow. We know we need to represent when a control is last validated or when a control is last tested. Let's make sure we plan out the workflow on how we're going to go about that process and how we're going to go about capturing that data. So this is going to be more of a process plan workflow level. So as we dive into, those data elements and looking at those planned processes, we need to decide, what do we currently do in our process? What do we like? What do we dislike? What are our pain points, as Andrea was kind of calling out? Those are ones that are going to be great to focus on to plan out that workflow and plan out your documentation needs. There's going to be situations where maybe your process isn't fully vetted. Maybe you have kind of partial processes that you're going to need to build up. So this is kind of where that whole brainstorming element is going to come into play and really make sure that you're striving again towards that end goal. So I know those all sound like loaded questions and big conversation pieces, but they really do open up the dialogue between you and your team to make sure that you're capturing, the data that you need, specifically how you need it, and then in that specific workflow and how you need that data to be structured. So with those two tips being said, the last little tip here to talk through on the brainstorming phase would be the write it down concept. So really here we're talking about pen to paper. I would say from my personal experience working with clients on a brainstorming phase, I'd say honestly 99.9% of the time as we're brainstorming, I'm either in front of a whiteboard or I have pen to paper. And as the conversation is taking place, as we're brainstorming out those specific data elements we need to start capturing, those specific workflows that we want to start creating amongst our team, I'm going to start putting that pen to paper and capturing a kind of basic data structure that I want to start implementing or use as my foundation to move forward. Not only does this concept and this exercise of pen to paper, it helps trigger creativity, helps the team and collaborate together and realize any gaps in the data structure that we haven't realized before. But it also just simply helps you visualize the process that you're planning and helps you kind of see the pieces start fitting together and make sure that you're headed in the right direction for your brainstorming of that data.
Yeah, Kailyn, I think that's a great point. And the thing that strikes me about this writing it down, it does seem kind of like rudimentary, like, oh, well, I should write it down. But there is something to be said, just like you say, just like you referenced, and we'll move on to the next slide here as just a quick example. But I look at something like this and it looks very simplistic. But when we were talking about it the other day, you can start to make some pretty powerful inferences just by understanding how these different objects of data are related to each other. You start seeing those interrelationships. So it looks like an example that you came across or from one of your engagements. So maybe you could talk a little bit more about this one.
Yeah, exactly, Jason. So that's exactly what this is representing, is just simply a sample or an example of one that I've put together for a client before. So right, kind of talking again about that brainstorming session that you might be having, as you're having those conversations and you're talking through what you're striving for and what that end workflow needs to be, I just simply kind of started putting my pen to paper and capturing what was being, discussed. So, for example, this is just a really simple standard streamlined control testing workflow, and just kind of the data structure as a holistic view here. So we knew right off the bat that the control record would be our main focus and our main center for this standard process. But just for an example, as we're having those conversations and as we're brainstorming what needs to fit where, we knew that this particular client liked to group their controls, based on their processes that they have outlined in their organization, and they have organizations in their business. So those are just kind of some simple ways that as the conversations are happening, you're going to be able to structure that and, again, visualize that data fitting together. Going a step further, throughout the conversation again, you're going to be able to see where all of those validations and different pieces need to come in. And this example is a bit more complicated and a bit more complex, but it's great to kind of show the two side by side. So as Jason mentioned on that previous one, it's pretty streamlined, pretty simple, but just kind of visualizes that process together. This is a great example and to kind of use to show that as you just continue your brainstorming and continue your conversations, add more detail in those visual aids, add more explicit actionable items that you want to plan on implementing or you're hoping to gain out of this general workflow. You can see here we've got anywhere from color coding to meaningful arrows, meaningful areas that you can see the process moving through the process, and you can see some actionable items that are called out, all of which are really helpful in that brainstorming phase to help you lay that foundation and that groundwork to kind of move forward into that build phase. I do want to pause here though and kind of, again, Andrea, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on, do you typically kind of do a pen to paper scenario where you do that exercise? Does that seem to help? What's your opinion on that?
Yeah, Kailyn, this actually looks very much like things that are frequently on my whiteboard. So definitely writing down the process helps you understand what exactly it is that you need in order to build that picture of success and be successful with building it by the time you're done. So having a process enables you to create things that obviously are standardized, and therefore those activities are predictable and reliable and help you drive those actionable insights and reporting that you need to run your function and address information needs from your stakeholders. So again, this is a great starting point, but where you go to from here is thinking about, all right, and if I have all this data, how can I leverage it to create additional insights, some of the things that I mentioned earlier?
Yeah, absolutely, Andrea. And I think it's a great segue into the next kind of phase that Kailyn's going to take us through here, is this concept of building, right? So, Kailyn, when you went through and did the pen to paper exercise, that's good for a couple of reasons, because number one, it helps you sort of, see the forest for the trees, so to speak, see how things are interrelated, see what those possibilities are. If we quickly go back to this slide, like the one example we talked about the other day was, the fact that risks are related to controls tells me that I can use the criticality of a risk to drive the frequency of my control testing, or I can see that I have findings down here that I can report at this organization level. So certainly understanding how everything is supposed to be pieced together, calling out those action items that are going to drive the development process. And then, Andrea, to your point, it's great, have the pen to paper, have the plan, but then it does come time to actually, put that structure in place, take it from pen and paper into, a table, into a spreadsheet, into a system, and find a way to really build that model that gives you that meaningful data. So Kailyn, would love to hear your perspective on kind of that cyclical process that you go through at times to help kind of build and refine those reports.
Yeah, definitely. And exactly how you kind of set this up is it very much needs to be an iterative process. So, I know that obviously this seems like a streamlined step 1, step 2, and 3, but this step 2 really needs to be kind of an iterative process that you continue through and through until you hit your end goal. So as we've kind of discussed, we've got the groundwork laid and we've got this plan for how we want to implement this documentation and this data. And as Jason said, no matter what platform you might be utilizing, Excel, we've got an idea of where we need to go. So let's start putting it together, and that's going to be that configure slide here. And as you do that, just naturally through conversations and once you start that work, new insights are going to come up. New information is going to come to light. Additional stakeholders might get involved, and they might provide differing opinions or additional opinions that you hadn't quite realized before. So all of that is to say that this piece specifically really needs to be flexible and really needs to be an iterative process where you can just get right back to the drawing board when you need to. So as you navigate through that, as you get there, you're going to navigate back to that drawing board, add in additional pieces as needed, add additional steps, and just continue that process until you hit that end goal. I would say rarely does my initial groundwork and my initial, mapping of items match what I end up with 100%. And due to this process, we're going to be continually adding and tweaking and adjusting until we get what we need to get to. I think, again, go ahead, Jason.
No, please finish, Kailyn.
I was going to say, hopping it back to Andrea, do you typically keep this as a pretty iterative process as well and kind of strive towards that end goal?
Oh my goodness, absolutely. And I think that the key word on this slide is adjust. We all have to be agile, and I don't think you're ever really done, because once you hit your goal of, what does my end game look like, frequently you're going to have insights as to what the next end goal looks like. Again, leveraging the information you have. So I'll give you an example of this. For us, in addition to internal audit, I'm responsible for facilitating our ERM process. And one of the things we wanted to be able to do was communicate to our senior leaders, of our enterprise risks, what is changing, what risks are, increasing, which risks are decreasing. And that was great. And we were able to do that, phase 1. But after that, it generated different questions. It was, well, okay, this risk is increasing. Why is it? And then we had to figure out, well, how do we show why? Why did it change? Was it an increase in likelihood, an increase in impact, a decrease in management effectiveness? Which one of those things? How many of those things? And then if it was, for example, a change in management effectiveness, well, how do we know that? Was there some sort of self-assessment that came back and indicated a change? Was there some control testing that was conducted by internal audit that revealed a number of failures? Making sure that we can explain the whys. You're never with your process. You'll never really be done building. And just because you keep building doesn't mean you failed. It is very, very iterative.
Well, and that's a great point, Andrea, because, it's not just about building and tweaking and modifying one existing workflow. I think the example you give is very appropriate in that, maybe you go down or you initially head down the path of saying, this is problem number 1. This is issue number 1 that I need to solve. And it's one of those things that, hey, once I figure out issue number 1, 3 or 4 more things come to light out of that. It's like the more we learn, the more we realize we don't know. So you learn new insights, or you feel like you've picked off, problem or question number 1. Well, that's just going to open up more questions. And so being able to not just build linearly and think about the one process and the one outcome, eventually you're going to hit different tangent points. And you're going to hit different places where you're like, well, gosh, now that I know this, it would be really helpful to know this. So Andrea, your example about, we could see risk is going up. Okay, why? Well, that requires maybe a deeper level of insight. Maybe there are situations that, you've encountered where you're like, well, I don't necessarily have all of the data I need to be able to answer that next question. So it also becomes about retrofitting the process to be able to have that other data. And we've got just a couple of examples that we can run through. And Andrea, I'd love to get your perspective on this. And, I know, Kailyn, you've built a lot of things along these lines. So just two kind of quick examples. One of them is just sort of an example about workload management. And Andrea, this is something you've shared with us before about how you use Onspring to maybe, manage workloads and understand, who has work in the queue. When's the last time they've done that? Is there anything I can do to help them along? Maybe give a little bit of that perspective.
Sure. This is helped us very recently with our COVID response. Like most of us, our company had a transition to largely remote work for our office workers. And as we're preparing to bring people back into the office, the question is, how do we know what work can be done effectively off-site versus on-site? And how do we know that whether we have been effective? We actually had a lot of that data right at our fingertips. We just weren't leveraging it. So for example, here when we're talking about workloads, we could see when auditors were starting to work on their tests, whether it's a control test or they're working on work papers as part of the course of the internal audit. And we could also see if, wow, the last time they touched something was maybe 10 days ago, 10 business days ago. And I'd be careful to say that you can't always just rely on your quantitative data, but use your quantitative data as an indicator to do some more qualitative investigation, to reach out to that person and say, hey, I know you haven't touched this particular work product in 10 days. Are you well? How are you doing? Do you need any help? Do you need help with a stakeholder? Have that dialogue is where we've been able to use it. It's also helped us see how efficient we are. How long is it taking to test something? How fast are we progressing toward completion in a particular audit? We actually had the data, but prior to the COVID pandemic, we weren't leveraging it to the extent we could.
Yeah, I imagine that's something that a lot of folks are running into. It's just, hey, now we're in need of certain information. The first question is, do we have it? The second question is it in a format that it can be used? And then, the third question is kind of that more existential question. Well, what insight can I gain out of this? Well, I think getting back to Kailyn's point about, with anything, thinking about what the end result is, what do I ultimately want to know, or what do I ultimately need to communicate? That can help you communicate back. So here in this example, we might, Andrea, it's kind of going along that example of managing workloads. So if we can see all of our auditors, for example, who have test work in process, we can always couple this with another view into that data. We might say, okay, well, that's great, but how important or how critical are the things that they're working on? Let's say those are stale dated tests, to your point. These are tests that people haven't touched maybe in 10 or more days. Okay, well, if I see green, or I see something that's maybe gray, that's maybe an indicator of, well, that's something that's not as high risk. Let's say in the SOX world in which you live, maybe that's something that's not as, likely to drive a significant deficiency or a material weakness. But if we see one that's, in the red, meaning, oh, we're mitigating or investigating a high level of risk, we can take that one step further and really drill down. And to your point, Andrea, let's get a sense of when is the last time that was touched, and proactively reach out to that individual. And Kailyn, I'm sure you've run into sort of similar situations where you're kind of pairing reports together or pairing data sets together to help tell a fuller story.
Definitely, and I think we've talked about that amongst each other before. Definitely kind of using similar data, maybe side by side, and you might see an alarming, or like Andrea was saying, potentially alarming data set on one, but then you might hop over and just dive a little bit further and understand, what's going on, and again, be able to start that conversation with your team members or your colleagues.
Yeah, I think that was a good example, Andrea, that you gave us, while we were planning for this. That hey, there's a little bit more to this than meets the eye, but it certainly doesn't mean you should ignore the quantitative data, but you can't go the other direction. And I always forget, Andrea, you have a really good phrase for talking about, the cautionary tale of relying too much on quantitative data.
Yeah. I wish I could remember the name of the author. I am remiss. I should have looked her up prior to this webcast. But my phrase is, be careful not to use your data as weapons of mass destruction. And that is actually the title of a really good book written by a data scientist a number of years ago. So again, my point is always remember that there are two sides to assessing things. One is definitely quantitative, and data analytics is getting all the hype right now, but in order to get the most out of your analytics, you need to be able to ask thoughtful questions that drive meaningful dialogue.
Absolutely. Just one more quick example, just another way that this data can be coupled, and I'll just walk through this very quickly, but here we have just a simple pie chart that breaks down all of our controls by their overall compliance status. Well, if I think about how I'm required to report this information to the board or to senior management, you could see here, you could see this orange slice over on the left-hand side. It tells me that I have 14 controls that have mitigation in process. And in this instance, it's telling me, hey, there's an active finding associated with that control. So one of the things that management might want to understand is, number one, who are the owners of those controls that are currently being mitigated? And not to pick on our friend Dustin again, but Dustin has the highest concentration or the largest number of his controls that are currently undergoing some level of mitigation. And when we set the data up correctly and structure it, what we have is the ability to very quickly and easily get down to the heart of that to say, for each of these controls, when is that anticipated mitigation due date? And then we can start cross-referencing some of that with risk data or criticality data if you're capturing that. I think the key point here is, getting back to the brainstorming and how you're going to build your process out, you're ultimately working toward a state where you can gain those insights. And if you know what those insights are when you begin with that end in mind, you can deconstruct and work backwards and say, oh, well, therefore, I need to be able to capture these data points at this time. And that's exactly, Kailyn, what you were talking about when you were showing your brainstorming examples, is how do we get to this point where we can, really make sense out of the data or make the sense out of it that we need to. And Kailyn, I'd love for you to kind of talk a little bit about this as well. It's obviously not just about capturing bits and pieces of data, but doing something more with that data.
Yeah, definitely. So this is a great example of, not only, again, have we brainstormed, thought through what do we need to capture, how are we going to utilize that data, how are we going to plan out our workflow and processes, but then, even provide a step further and provide a more holistic view of your data and where that sits. So just as Jason went through those examples of those reports, and we kind of gave our 2 cents on how you're going to interpret the data through them, something else that we definitely like to add in is the use of formulas. So what this does is this allows you to have one singular field throughout your data that's going to represent where that sits through the entire process. That's going to really allow you to leverage your data and leverage those reports to the best that they can be, and see a great holistic view of where that data sits just off of this one field.
Absolutely. And while I kind of go back to, I'm going to send you guys, the participants, send you guys another quick survey, just interested in knowing kind of what methods you're using to keep your stakeholders up to date, if it's, somewhat, kind of ad hoc, if there's a process that you have in place. But yeah, Kailyn, absolutely. When you think about, it's not just capturing, again, those little bits and pieces of data, but there's definite insights to be gained when starting to look at collections of individual pieces of data. And I always like to use the phrase, you're taking data and converting it to information. And that's where the real power definitely comes in. All right, let's take a look at our survey here. I'm going to go ahead and send those results to the audience so you guys can take a look and see how you responded. Again, kind of that bell curve, right? And I the vast majority of folks are maybe have a scheduled timetable and a set of reports, that they're proactively providing that information out. But doing it through email, I'm sure it causes some administrative burden. Doing certain follow-up through email is going to potentially result in some administrative burden. Administrative burden that if pushed off to the side and automated where it makes sense, that's where you can start freeing up your time and the time of the folks on your team to sort of focus on those bigger and better things. So with that, I'm going to definitely tip my hat to Andrea on this next slide to kind of, go through another really step 3 in this process is almost like this automated optimization. And Andrea, I really loved the example you gave here. So maybe you can just kind of give us your thought process on why we're looking at the Domino's tracker here. And thankfully, I've already eaten lunch. So.
Yeah, thank you for entertaining my goofy analogies, Jason. So that last slide that Kailyn showed, formulas make a lot of people's, including my own, head spin, and sometimes you just shut off after that because it just starts getting too complicated. So whether you're using Excel or whether you're using a tool, those statuses that Kailyn showed can be used as alerts. And those additional insights that you can gather from your data can help make your own compliance process more transparent and frankly fun for your stakeholders. So I was explaining to Jason and Kailyn how as a result of our response to COVID and some of the additional data we were looking at, we're able to make some of our process more fun for our stakeholders. And I know that sounds counterintuitive, but when you think about it, we're living in a world where, we've got smartwatches and fitness trackers and all kinds of apps on our phones that can do things like tell us, the weather, what's the weather going to be today so I know what to wear, or maybe I should wear an umbrella, to, this example here, which is I just ordered a pizza. When should I leave to pick it up? And hey, based on how long it's looking like it's going to take, what might I be able to do in the meantime? Or more serious things like, okay, so I go to the doctor and I have some blood work done and I can log in. I've got an app on my phone and it tells me I had blood work and, hey, my test results are ready and they're not so bad. Or my blood pressure is within normal range, or not doing so well this month. We can do the same thing with our own processes, and doing that helps our stakeholders because it demystifies what we're doing them. It takes out fear, and it gives them the ability to make more efficient use of their time and also our own staff time.
Yeah, I love this example, Andrea, and the way we talked about it, it was like, I'm sure that if I'm someone who owns a control and I'm undergoing some level of compliance review, that's going to cause, even the slightest bit of consternation, right? You just don't know what it is. You want to do a good job, but knowing where things are in the process and understanding when people need something from you versus when they don't is something that's definitely very powerful.
Yeah, so what we did is, sorry, Jason.
No,
so just to build on that.
Go ahead. No, please go ahead.
Yeah, briefly, what we did is we used the data. So as soon as an auditor was testing something, our stakeholders now get an email to say, hey, internal audit's looking at whatever. We'll be doing this for the next number of days, and we will alert you along the way to let you know where we are in the process if we need anything. And, by the way, when we're done, we'll let you know how it went. It's all
I love
automated.
that. Absolutely, and that goes back to kind of what Kailyn was talking about harnessing that data to produce other information and then using that to kind of drive things through the process. As we sort of wind down, I want to be respectful of everyone's time here. We're getting into the last 10 minutes or so, but we really wanted to share this information. This is information from a recent Gartner survey. That you see the title of the slide is "Doing More with Less." I swear, I was in internal audit. About 9-10 years ago, and that phrase was still being used back then. It's still being used now. It seems to be a common theme. But just to give you a quick kind of a synopsis of these numbers we're looking at. So the 74% that is the number of compliance programs that are reporting experiencing some level of increased expectation on the level and the quality of the work they're doing. 60% reported feeling like their capabilities, their technologies, their skill sets lagged behind in terms of where they felt they should be. And then the 2/3 for those same compliance groups are those that say, well, we expect our budgets to either remain flat or decrease over the course of the next 2 years. So when you mash all that together, we've got increasing expectations where people feel like they're a little bit behind the curve and they're not going to get a lot more money or resources to address that. So that's a dangerous mix there. That's a concerning mix. But again, it really just highlights the idea and the concept that we've been trying to share of really keeping things simple, but finding power in the simple things. And as you start simply, you're going to have the ability to use your start as a building block to something else. Kailyn's talked about it, Andrea's talked about it, where one idea begets 5 other ideas. So just a few quick takeaways of what we'd love for you guys to remember. Having that clear picture of success, it kind of ties back to the whole 7 habits of highly effective people. Begin with the end in mind. Know what your goal is and what you want to accomplish, and that will help inform a good deal of your process. Connecting data. When I think about Kailyn's diagrams and showing the interrelationships of data, it's great to see how data is interrelated, but also keep in mind that you can tell a story, tell a lot of different stories based on those interconnections. And then this is a point, number 3, I probably should let Andrea address this one because this was something she definitely had some strong feelings on as well.
Yeah, Jason, so let stakeholders self-serve. So the example I was giving is, we've got all these neat little apps that we use, and it's fun. We all use them. We all check them to know where things are at. Nothing will eat more of your time or frustrate an executive more than when they're walking around with a report generated out of Excel that has information on it that's 2 weeks old, right? Resolving that takes forever and is aggravating. But when you can give someone access to real-time data that answers exactly the question that they have, you're doing everyone a good service. So, for example, what's coming due? What things in my organization are coming due in the next 30 days? What needs more of my time? What don't I need to worry about? Those are all things that you probably have access and data on right now that doesn't take a lot of effort to make of greater use to other people.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for that. And Barbara, I'm going to go ahead and turn this back over to you.